Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to share with you a famous game that was played between the legendary British Grandmaster Mickey Adams and the Norwegian prodigy and already #1 player in the world, Magnus Carlsen. Magnus rose to the elite of the world of chess already as a teenager. However, as this game will show, sometimes lack of experience or maybe overconfidence can cause troubles even if you're as good of a player as he is. At the same time, it will also show that despite playing a very suspicious opening, he didn't lose the game because of it. I'd like to repeat over and over my view on the fact how unimportant it is to spend time on learning openings. Why? Because as long as you don't blunder pieces which has nothing to do with opening knowledge, you will get a playable game. And there will be plenty of opportunities to come back. Generally, your opponents will also make inaccuracies or mistakes even if they get a little bit of an advantageous start out of the opening. Well, let me show you what I'm talking about. So this is how the game started. e4, g6, which is still a normal start, the Pirt's defense. And white played d4. So far everything is very normal. And this is where Mickey Adams' opponent, Magnus Carlsen, played a very strange move. There is a general rule of thumb that whenever you play g6 and are about to fianchetto your bishop by a bishop going to that cleared square, g7 in this case, it's generally best to do it right away, not to keep those dark squares open and unattended. Let that bishop occupy that amazing, beautiful square g7 from where it pastes through the long diagonal, and ultimately that's the purpose of black's previous move. There are very few exceptions when you would not want to do that. The surprising part is that Magnus Carlsen in this position played a very unusual move, knight f6, developing the knight ahead of the bishop after playing g6. By the way, this is not just in reference to g6 moves, but of course it could be the b6, bishop b7 move, or for white, b3, bishop b2, g3, bishop g2. Usually those move hand in hand, one after another. So in our case, black played the knight to f6, immediately attacking white's pawn on e4 and inviting white to immediately chase the knight away. And black's next move was going the knight to h5. Very strange strategy. Generally, we always say, do not put your knight on the edge of the board. I certainly do not like this move. While it's true that white does not have a forced win in this position, but nevertheless white has certainly a very comfortable game, could play just slowly developing, or perhaps could even try something more ambitious. But in any case, I don't see any advantage for black to try this unusual development of the knight, spending 2 moves to put it on the edge of the board. And remember, for example, if white right now makes just a normal developing move with the knight, black can't even follow up with a normal development of bishop g7. Why? Because that knight on h5, and that's exactly why it's usually not recommended to put a knight on the edge of the board, it will be trapped with g4. So I personally don't like the idea for black to do this, but as we shall see, white maybe got surprised. Certainly got surprised and maybe confused a little bit, and we'll see that later black actually got back into the game. So now the game continued with white playing bishop e2, immediately trying to attack the knight a second time, and perhaps that's exactly what Magnus had in mind and played d6 in this position, ignoring the threat on the knight. Stefan Bicker, who is a German master, he is known for cultivating these unusual and highly suspicious openings, which sometimes can work as a surprise weapon, although I would say they are likely not to work more often than they do. His comments were that white's best option is actually not to accept the pawn sacrifice and not to take on h5, but to play as Mickey Adams did, just simply continuing to develop knight f3. You may wonder, but why not capture the knight and then the pawn with the queen? It's certainly a playable idea, but black on one hand got a pair of bishops, got the g file opened, which sometimes may lead to some counterplay with rook g8, and black has some compensation. I can't say that necessarily it's sufficient compensation, but apparently players who have analyzed this position, like Stefan Becker or Mickey Adams at the board at least, felt that there is no need to kind of fall into any kind of home preparation of black. Obviously, if Magnus played d6 on move 4, did it for a reason, hoping that white would get carried away and would like to kill black's position immediately by winning a pawn with bishop takes knight. So this is very common in grandmaster practice, that we see that one side prepares a surprise gambit, which this we could call whenever we sacrifice a pawn for an active position that's considered a gambit, and therefore oftentimes the other side simply tries to play it safe and avoid the risk into stepping into home preparation into very complicated situations. So as a conclusion, white simply played knight f3 just to continue with development, because white clearly must be better because they are better developed, and black's knight on a5 is certainly positioned weirdly. And black further delays the development of the bishop. Again, this is something very unusual and certainly not something I would recommend from black's perspective. Black played knight c6 and white traded on d6 and black captured back. And white played d5. I'm not sure if there was a specific rush to do this move. May have been better just to castle right away. Black played knight e7 and white played c4, giving black the time to finally develop the bishop to g7. Of course, just in case you were wondering if in this position white would play queen d4, trying to attack the black rook, of course the black rook would not have to move, which would have meant black losing the right to castle to the king side, but black would simply just answer the attack with a counter-attack by playing bishop g7, and black would be just fine. So after knight a7, white instead responded with c4 and bishop g7. Now all of a sudden we find ourselves in a relatively normal looking position, despite the strange start to the game. These type of positions often happen from various openings. White played knight c3 and black castled, and so did white. So now what do we see? White still has a little bit of space advantage. However, because the white pawn on the d file already went as far as to d5, it means that black's bishop on g7 actually has a very nice diagonal, and it's certainly a superior piece, I would say, to any of the white minor pieces. So black is not doing as bad as they should have after such a shaky start. So white now continued after bishop g4, putting the rook on the only open file with bishop e1, and black is preparing, doing just the same. And so typically white played h3, attacking the black bishop. It's a smart idea, certainly, asking the bishop, decide, do you want to trade, give up your pair of bishops, or do you want to retreat? Of course, if the bishop would retreat just to f5, that wouldn't be wise, because white could fork immediately on the black bishop and knight. So therefore the bishop could only consider retreat all the way to d7, but then of course that makes it questionable. Why did the bishop go to g4 the first place? So therefore Magnus Carlsen traded the bishop for the knight, which is probably the best choice under the circumstances, and naturally the bishop captures back, not the pawn, because if the pawn would, that would ruin the pawn structure as well as the safety of white's king. So now already white would be ready to capture black's knight on h5 unless it moves away, and of course it has to. Knight moved back to f6, and finally white is ready to develop the last undeveloped minor piece as well, bishop to f4, and came knight d7. So finally black is improving the position of that knight, moving it from h5 back to f6 and to d7. d7 is actually quite a good place for the knight, because it will have the opportunity to go from d7 to e5, or in some cases to c5, which are both excellent centralized positions for black's knight. Also, in some cases, of course not probably while queens are on the board, but black can think of trading bishop to knight on c3, doubling up white's pawn along the c file. So that explains white's next move, rook c1, making sure even at a later stage, if bishop takes, the rook can take back, and probably more concretely making sure that the white pawn will be able to move forward either for defensive or offensive purposes. Oftentimes in such situations white would try to play b4 and then follow it by c5, or as we shall see in the actual game, after knight e5, when black attacks white's pawn on c4, now white has the opportunity to simply protect that pawn. And you certainly wouldn't want to play b3 while your knight is unprotected on c3. And now the game continued with a6. It's a move that considers the idea of playing b5 in the future, as well as prevents any ideas of knight b5. And in this position, white continued with g3, I think with the idea to then retreat the bishop to g2. And at this moment, according to the comments of Magnus himself, he said that despite the unusual opening choice that I started with, I was quite satisfied with my position in the middle game. However, here at this point I got over-optimistic, playing for a win, and underestimated my opponent's coming attack, and therefore I deserve my loss. Well, in other words, here he should have traded knight for bishop with a reasonable position. But instead he went all out, played knight f5, giving white the opportunity to hide his own bishop to g2, and now he played g5, which is certainly over-optimistic, weakening too many squares around black's king. And now white played very energetically and well, started by trading bishop for a knight on e5. Remember, if the white bishop would have came back to d2, that would allow black to play knight d3 with an active position. Let's go back. After g5 came bishop takes e5, bishop takes, and knight e4. White wants to get all the pieces quickly to the king's side to attack the enemy king. The next move white would make, if allowed, to move the queen to h5 and target black's g5 pawn a second time. Therefore, black retreated the knight, preventing the white queen arriving to h5, and perhaps hoping to play f5, chasing white's knight back. But Adams didn't give an opportunity or time for that, and played queen d2, attacking the g5 pawn a second time in addition to the knight. Now the queen is also attacking it, and when black protected the pawn, then it was the time to play f4. A very smart move. Black traded, and the bishop has only one safe place to go to on f6. And now that the G file has opened, it's very typical and logical to make sure we get our king out of any potential danger of that file, and more importantly, to prepare our rook, or maybe even rooks in the future, to get to the G file to attack the enemy king. And this is the move that caused a lot of troubles for black. Black again went back to that same h5 square that he did early in the game, and it wasn't a good idea already back then. Just like in the beginning of the game, it's better to centralize the knight, play knight f5 with still an unclear position. After knight h5, now things are rolling nicely for white. Came rook g1, preparing a discovered attack by discovery bishop f3 check, winning or attacking black's knight on h5. And here black was better off trying to run the other way by playing king f8, but chose the suspicious king h7. Another rule of thumb is that in positions, especially when there are open diagonals or files for the enemy queen or bishop, it's generally better to avoid moving to that color squares. As you shall see in a little bit, that king will get in trouble because it moved to that light square where the white bishop or queen could attack it. In the meantime, black is threatening a little trap by capturing white's pawn on f4 in hopes that if then queen takes knight, then the black bishop would pin white's queen with bishop e5. Therefore, white simply moved the rook to f1, protecting it, so in case knight captures on f4 right now, then white could first trade knight for bishop with check, and then capture safely the knight and win a piece. So going back, after rook c2 f1, black played rook g8 now, queen e2, attacking the knight, knight g7, and now time for the actual attack against the enemy king. Queen d3, a very powerful move with immediate threat to checkmate in 2 moves by either next capturing black's bishop or moving the knight to g5. Either one would be double check. The black king would be forced to move to the corner, and then the white queen comes down to h7 to checkmate. So came king h8, absolutely necessary, otherwise the double check arrives. And now white simply regroups the bishop. A very wise plan. Look at that. There's not much that black can do about it. Bishop f3, b5, bishop d1, take, bishop h4, and bishop c2. So the bishop arrived, and now that means that this knight really threatens to jump practically any square, and then with the idea to checkmate, queen h7. So therefore black played f5, trying to lock up that diagonal. It's true that black saved that problem, but created a new one. Now that the pawn is gone from f7, the g6 square is open for white's rook. And it's a very strong move, threatening checkmate immediately by capturing pawn on h6. Therefore, black had no choice but to protect the pawn. And white doubles up simply. Now, of course, if black captures, queen captures back, black would face unsolvable problems because of the double check threats with the rook followed by checkmate. Therefore, black did not capture, but played queen e7, trying to hang on and defend, and now, of course, threatened to take on e4, because after queen takes pawn on e4, then already the queens could be traded. So therefore, white simply moved the knight out of the way, threatening now to capture the pawn on f5. Therefore, bishop took, queen took back. And now black is in major troubles. White is threatening to checkmate in just two moves. For example, after a peaceful, quiet move like rook e8. Can you see the checkmate? And yes, here is the answer. Check and checkmate. Quite pretty. Black is pretty hopeless already in this position. For example, if they would have played knight h5, the response would be queen f3, takes, bishop f5, rook g8, then simply queen h5. Or if knight f4 first, then queen takes, rook g8, h5, trying to use the pin. And if black plays h5 himself, then rook g5 with a winning position. The game itself concluded after black played queen f7, which made things even easier for white. Now came bishop d1, rook e8, and the final blow with a nice little combination, rook h6, when black resigned, because if now king takes, queen g5, king h7, queen h4 check, knight h5, bishop takes, and black is lost because the discovery by the bishop is coming, or even checkmate, depending how black continues. What's the moral of this game? Well, I don't suggest playing such offbeat, unusual openings that breaks opening principles, such as putting a knight to the edge of the board. At the same time, I'd like to point out that black, at the end of the day, did not lose the game just because of it, but did because of future mistake. Well, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we are. In this beautiful endgame, it seems that white is clearly losing because black has an extra queen. I suggest you take at least a few minutes, or up to 10 minutes, and try to figure out on your own how come white can save the game. Have fun, and then come back, listen to the answer. The answer is a simple repetition of moves. White has an elegant combination, putting the bishop under dual attack immediately. Now if king takes, white forks and wins the black queen this way, or if the black queen captures, the fork comes the other way, and again black will lose his queen, resulting a drawn endgame. And finally, if the black king moves out of the check, then white simply persists, keep giving the checks. If king back to f8, bishop back to e7, king to g7, bishop f6, and of course it would be suicidal for black to try to play for a win, because after king h7, actually they get checkmated. A beautiful endgame. I hope you enjoy this lesson and be back next week for some more chess ideas. Bye bye.